Welcome to the Sleep Haunt. Tonight, we enter the realm of the unseen, 9 of the most disturbing ghost stories. These are the whispers in empty rooms, the footsteps on quiet floors, and the figures that vanish when you dare to look too long. They don't shout, they linger, patient and close, just beyond the edge of sight. Stay with me until the final echo, and if you enjoy nights like this, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next haunting. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where these stories travel. Story number 1. The curve had a name long before maps admitted it. The rails bent there, as if leaning away from the ocean wind, and the little signal house, a square of glass and timber, watched it like an eye that never blinked. In daylight, the place looked practical: paint peeling, iron levers standing in neat ranks, a kettle dented at the rim. At night, fog worked its way through the marsh and turned the air into pale cloth. Lamps hung like slow stars. The whistle of far trains was less a sound and more a line drawn in the mind. He was sent to mine the place when the newer systems hiccuped. They called him Rowan, a name that fit the steadiness of his hands and the careful way he set a thermos down. He had no superstition in him that anyone could see, only a talent for listening to machines as one listens to a sleeping house. The old signal house had been quiet for years, yet the line wasn't dead. Maintenance crews used it. A handful of early trains coasted through before dawn. It needed a person there for a while, someone to watch the floor of needles on the gauge panel, to keep the wind from having its way with the doors. The first night, the air was so clear that even the moor beyond the marsh sat neatly on the horizon, a cut paper line against the sky. Moths tattooed the windows. He checked the levers, logged the time, turned up the lamp, and paused by the clock. The clock had a whistle of its own, soft, a breath between ticks. It pleased him to hear it keep time, old as it was. Overhead, tin gutters clicked and settled as the temperature changed. Ordinary things, nothing more. At 2:14, the bell on the wall rang. It was an ordinary bell. Green paint freckled with rust, mouth the size of a fist. He'd tested it earlier with the little brass hammer. It should have been silent now. The wire that fed it had been cut and crimped back with tape years ago. Yet the bell rang with a single clean note, the sound of a spoon briefly kissing the rim of a glass. He set the thermos down and stood still, hands loose at his sides. The bell did not ring again. The tide, or the wind, or the house had made some trick of it, he decided. He wrote the time in the log regardless. The pencil stayed steady. He poured tea and listened harder than before. Somewhere out in the fog, a heron lifted from the grass and beat its large wings toward the river mouth. He watched the gauges and the lamp. The night, after that solitary note, behaved. The second night, he arrived earlier. He swept the floor, not because it needed it, but to smooth his thoughts. The wooden broom handle fit his palm as if it had waited for it. Tools, like places, learned the weight of their keepers. Again he made the rounds. Again the clock kept its small, breathy song. Again, at 2:14, the bell made that one crystalline sound and then fell silent, as if a finger had pressed softly against its mouth. At 2:15 the telegraph key clicked. There was no telegraph. The polished key sat on the shelf like a relic, brass dulled with age, lever halted in the middle of its arc. He had cleaned it for something to do the afternoon before, polishing the metal with a cloth, and thinking of the hands that once knew the rhythms of distant towns. Now the lever rocked under its own will, and struck its anvil once. A light kiss, a polite excuse me, in a language retired long ago. He stepped closer, felt the answer of cool brass under his finger. Nothing moved. The lever was heavy. It would have taken a tapped force to make it lift and fall. He told himself the building settled, that old frames did odd things when the temperature changed, that air could do strange tricks inside narrow wood. He wrote 2:14 bell in the ledger. He wrote 2:15 click. He drew a long line under the note, then a shorter line immediately under the long line, as if closing an entry. He didn't know why that felt important. On the third night, fog moved in early. It arrived like sleep, with no single moment to point to and say, "There, that's when." Just a gradual softening of edges, a silvering of the far reeds, a dimming of stars. A distant buoy made a sound like a patient throat being cleared. The signal house stood as square and present as a childhood memory. He lit the lamp and watched the light draw a circle on the glass, a warm coin against the cold. 2:14 told the clock without being asked. The bell obliged. The telegraph key's single click came a minute later. Afterwards, the room changed. It was nothing that could be held or named. The hair on his forearms lifted. The kettle didn't quite boil. The hands of the clock, which he'd wound carefully, ticked, 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 and then lingered between one mark and the next for a breath, as though thinking, before continuing. He went to the cupboard. Inside, tucked beneath a box of spare fuses, lay the railway's old leather-bound timetable, the kind no one used anymore. It had been there since he arrived, but he had not opened it. Now he did. The covers creaked. Between the onion skin pages, he smelled paper and dust warmed by years. He half expected to see only blankness, or the clean lines of print fading toward the spine. Instead, he found a note in a small, exact hand on the first page. It said, in pencil sharpened so keenly, the words looked almost threaded. Please. Read at 2:14. He checked the page again. The note wasn't ink. It was graphite sunk into fiber, old, smudged faintly at the edges as if a thumb had brushed it. No date. He looked through the timetable for an entry at 2:14. The book, obedient as if it had been asked, fell open to a page pressed down more than the others, the spine tired there. Trains and times marched in neat columns. Beside one line, Night Goods 37, the margin bore the pale memory of erasure, as if a name had once been pressed there, then removed and leaves rubbed over it to soften the scar. Rowan stood with the book open and felt the signal house listen with him. Outside, the fog worked its gentle machine over the marsh. He crossed to the window and looked out, lamp low to cut glare. Nothing moved, yet he could not stop the sense that something expected an answer. He went to the panel. He laid his hand on the lever that commanded the red signal at the curve. The lever's paint was worn where countless palms had rested. He did not simply throw it. He waited for the instinct that sometimes visits those who keep watches, the quiet feeling that this would be the moment to act. He felt for the rhythm in the night that the bell suggested, the single click that marked its heartbeat, the stilled breath in the clock when its hands paused a fraction of a heartbeat before the next mark. Then he pulled the lever. The iron complained, not from reluctance but from surprise at being useful again. He watched the distant lamp at the curve bloom red through the fog. A modest berry of light. A minute later, the rumble came. It was not a scheduled train, not at that hour, not on that line. It sounded smaller, hollow, like the wheels of a maintenance trolley tucked in under someone's arms and pushed because the motor had died. Lanterns shone at its corners. Two figures rode it, hoods up, heavy with damp. They did not see the signal until the red was upon them. Their eyes were white in the fog, faces turned up as the small trolley squealed obediently to a stop short of the curve where the earth had slumped away in the last rainstorm. A black mouth of absence had opened there beside the rail, reeds bowed like a curtain discovering a missing audience. The figures stood in the breath of the trolley's cooling motor. They looked toward the signal house. They lifted hands. There were no words between them and Rowan. The fog ate voices whole, but the gratitude was obvious in the loosened shoulders, the hand that found the others back for a moment, the way they looked at the red light as people look at a door that has closed in time. They made a call on a radio and waited for the work crew. Rowan kept the signal red until the rails were checked and made safe. He did not record heroics in the ledger. He simply wrote the time, underlined it twice, and added the scantiest comment, washout discovered. Then, on a whim he would not have admitted to his practical self, he wrote beneath that in small letters, thank you. At 3:03, when the work was done, the telegraph key clicked once more. Not cold, not mechanical, a simple acknowledgement. After that, the lever slid back to green as if guided by an extra hand, though his hand remained on the grip, his own knuckles pale in the lamplight. The night breathed out. Word of the near miss traveled along cables and ties, but not in the same way. In the office in town, someone mentioned Luck. Luck did a lot of work in that office. Rowan returned to the signal house the next night without being told to. He brought a new thermos and a pencil sharpened with a knife, the clean kind of point that did not crumble at first writing. The pattern continued. Night after night, The bell called 2:14. The telegraph key, courteous as an old neighbor, tapped once at the heels of the bell. The clock would pause, like a thought making up its mind. Sometimes the red lever felt warmer beneath his palm than the room allowed. And sometimes there was no apparent reason at all. He would switch the signal to red, and nothing came. The fog would lift. The rails would show clean and true. He would throw the signal back to green and feel foolish, until another night when a fox darted across the tracks, or a long length of tarpaulin, some loose skin shed by a truck, would lift and try to wrap its hungry mouth around a distant signal, and the world would remind him that not all dangers have size. He learned, without learning how, to listen for other marks of that presence. A particular moth returned each night. A moth with a nibbled wing. It circled the lamp and then settled on the same section of window pane, as if the window were a stage and that square its assigned place. When the moth came, he found the bell more likely to ring. On nights when the fog smelled briefly of cold leaves under snow, the wrong smell, out of season, the telegraph key liked to talk. Once he laid the edge of his hand against the desk and felt a rhythm there. He tapped his finger. The telegraph lever did not move, but the rhythm answered. He tapped again with a silly pattern he half remembered from a song on the radio. The answer returned an older pattern of 2 longs, 3 shorts. The next day, he looked it up. Keep clear. All practical explanations remained, of course. He did not evade them. Older systems sometimes hummed with nonsense when damp got into them. Houses, too, confessed and sighed, but the signal house seemed to behave better when he answered rather than ignored. He did not speak aloud. He did not want to conjure the feeling of talking to himself. He only acted in ways that acknowledged what he'd been given: the times, the note in the book, the click at odd minutes. He found himself humming a tune he didn't quite know. It felt like a tune old men might have hummed on a winter night with their hands in the pockets of their heavy coats, waiting for trains that would not mind if they were late by 2 minutes. On the 10th night, the wind changed. It came from inland, bringing scents of damp wood and river mud. The sea's steady breath fell quiet, as if listening too. The bell did not ring at 2:14. The telegraph key stayed. The clock ticked without that small catch between marks. He wrote the time and put a dot beside it anyway, a dot that said something was expected but did not arrive. He walked to the door and opened it, and let the new wind move through. It blew his hair back and lifted the edge of a page on the timetable. It made a small sound in a glass bottle on the shelf, a tone like someone running a wet finger around a crystal rim. In that tone was a sadness, not the kind that floods a room, but the kind that lives like an old letter in a drawer, a knowledge of a thing that happened once and cannot unhappen. He let the wind move around him. Then he closed the door and returned to his post. An older worker came by the next afternoon with a bag of bolts and a tin of biscuits. The older man set the tin down with a tap of ring-on lid and looked around the room with eyes that measured history. "Did you ever hear about the curve?" he asked, as if the answer might have sunk into the floorboards, and he was checking to see if the building would answer for them. Rowan made a questioning sound that promised story if the other wanted to tell it. "My grandfather's day," the man went on. "Storm. Lanterns went out on the far side. Goods train came through slower than it ought to have, but not slow enough. It was dark as a pocket. Nobody talks about it because there's nothing to talk about that hasn't been talked about before. They put up better lights after. Some places keep their memories like a pebble in a shoe. This is one of those spots. Don't let it worry you, mind. If it wanted to fret you, it would have done it by now." Rowan offered the biscuits back, and the man took one, then left the tin. "For the nights when the kettle doesn't boil right," he said, and he thumped the doorframe once on the way out, the way men thump tailgates and fence posts, a small way of making a noise to be counted by whatever listens. The 11th night, the bell waited an extra beat before voicing its note. It came at 2:17 instead, and he wrote that in the ledger and underlined it twice. It was as if someone had walked a little farther that night or had paused to check a lock. The telegraph did not click, but when he laid his palm flat on the desk, the grain felt as though a tremor moved under it, a long, slow wave like the roll of a ship. He closed his eyes and saw, for the first time, the curve as it might have looked before the paint peeled and the gutter rusted. Fresh ballast. Lanterns burning straight-backed. A coat hung from a peg. a different kettle on the stove, and a man in that coat, a cap pulled down, a pencil worn to a stub. He saw the man turn the pencil over and write on the first page of a timetable, in careful letters, "Please." Read at 2:14. He did not see the man's face. That was not given. He only felt the intent, pressed down as surely as the point of the pencil pressed down into paper grain. He opened his eyes then and found his hand on the lever. He did not remember moving it. He did not pull. He waited. The bell did not ring again that night. Days gathered the way they do in a place that measures its life in small duties. He swept. He wiped the windows when the salt left its fine skin. He fed the kettle fresh water and let it boil full once to clear the taste. He oiled the levers with a light touch, the oil can's long nose creeping into joints as if sharing a secret. He wrote everything down. He would not have known how to explain the pattern to anyone else, but when he turned pages back, he saw the same tidy hand with its underlines and its careful dots, his own answering a call given by another tidy hand in another year. He did not know when his handwriting had started to resemble the other. A week later, a different kind of day broke. The light came up green as a bottle. Rain walked across the moor in straight gray lines, and the signal house smelled like wet wool. An excursion was scheduled to pass well after dawn. Engines were checked, crews briefed. The little station in town swept its platform and set out a pot of flowers someone had thought to bring. In the signal house, the bell made no sound at 2:14, though he waited. The telegraph was quiet. He felt a shift in the air, like that moment when a bird changes direction without seeming to move its wings at all. At 3:03, the bell rang. Not one clean note, but two longs and three shorts. The same pattern that had come under his finger on the desk when he'd played a song to the wood. The clock hesitated at the mark between 3:03 and 3:04, and then, like a decision made in an office far away, crossed it. He did not think this time. He threw the red signal, and then took the points lever and shifted it, metal grinding on metal. The deep-noted sound that means weight is being moved. A low rush built in the fog. Not a train exactly, but the threat of one. The sound of a long body rushing to make a time it had no right to make. The signal house seemed to hold itself still, as if even buildings can hold their breath. Nothing burst through the gray. No lights, no engine. Instead, the rush of sound slid along him, and over the building, and down the line, as if a train had indeed passed, but chosen not to be seen. He felt the air pressure change. He felt the lamp flame sway. He felt the papers on the desk lift and settle. And then the quiet returned as if it had been present all along, and had only turned its face away for a second. He set the points back to their ordinary course, and returned to the lever that ruled the red lamp at the curve, and held it down as if the lever were the hand of someone he did not want to leave. When the crew came at dawn to run the excursion empty over the line ahead of its passengers, they found a branch down across the rails beyond the curve, heavy with rain and leaves. Not a tree, nothing grand. A limb large enough to offend, small enough to be missed in the fog by anyone who wanted to trust luck. They cleared it, and ran the engine slow and sure. The schedule held. People folded prams, lifted small cases, and took their seats later that morning with no sense that anything had gone wrong in the hours before their day began. That is one of the kindest things nights do. They carry troubles without remark. Several weeks later, Rowan opened the timetable to the first page and found the faint pencil marks altered, not erased, not rewritten, simply as if an extra pressure had been brought to bear on the graphite, deepening the grooves that already existed. It made no sense. Paper does not do such things. And yet there it was. Please. Read at 2:14. He traced the words without touching them and felt foolish for the way his throat caught. He put the book away and went back to work. The assignment ended with very little ceremony. The newer systems, which had been sulking since spring, found their temper again with summer's generosity. The line did not need a person there anymore, not physically. He could watch from a screen in an office if he wished. He did not argue. He took the logbook, his logbook, and left it on the shelf for whoever came when whoever came did. He did not take the kettle or the oil can or the little bottle that sang when the wind was in a particular mood. He set the lever to neutral and checked the window latches and thumped the door frame with his fist, gentle, the way the older man had done. He did not want to say goodbye out loud. He had a superstition in him at last, and it was this: that names matter, and that saying them invites them further in or further out depending on tone, and he did not know which he wanted. On his way down the steps, something made him turn back. Not a sound he could put a word to. Not the bell it had been content to keep its single note to itself for a week now. Nor the telegraph key. He simply turned, because sometimes a person turns, and he looked back through the window and saw the clock. The minute hand, which had been on the mark between 6 and 7, lifted like a person lifts an eyebrow. It hesitated, and then dropped back with a tiny acceptance. He smiled at the clock, the way one smiles at a child who has decided to do the right thing without being asked. He walked away. The curve still has its name. On certain nights when the fog is thick and the tide is neither coming nor going but considering it, a red pinprick can be seen where the line bends, though no rider can say for sure whether the light stands in the world or behind the eyes. Bells sometimes imitate other bells. The telegraph key has learned the weight of a new hand now, one that taps only to dust it and sets its lever down softly. And yet, in the hour when the air tastes of cold leaves out of season, 2 longs and 3 shorts can be felt in the wood if a palm lies there in trust, a pattern that means, keep clear. It is not a story of cruelty. It is a story of, that is all, of someone, once, writing a small plea into a book, of a room, learning to keep time around a request, of bell wire that should not carry current finding a way to be heard, of a curve leaning away from the sea, of nights that know the difference between silence and quiet. Sometimes a haunt is a hand at one's shoulder, when the light has swung a little too far. Sometimes the disturbing thing is not what a presence wants, but what it refuses to stop doing, year after year, until someone says thank you. Story number 2. After midnight, the building changed its manners. In daytime, it stood all straight edges and spotless glass, a certainty drawn against the sky. Past the hour when the last conference room lights winked out, it softened. Airborne dust became calm, like snow settling in a globe. The heat lowered its voice. Corridors, so sure of their destinations a few hours earlier, seemed to consider other routes. In this quiet, the elevator chime sounded not like a machine but like a reminder that gravity's moods could be polite. Mara worked those hours, a night caretaker with a ring of keys, a sturdy cart, and a habit of listening for the small ways a building tells the truth about itself. She had the kind of patience that grows not from certainty but from the practice of writing things down. The logbook on her cart carried her compact handwriting door alarms tested at the hour, air handlers checked, roof hatch latched, lights off in the copy center. She liked the east bank of elevators best. Their brushed steel doors always looked freshly ironed. Their floors, with a tiny fleck of gold running through gray stone, did not throw back a face too brightly. She kept her gloves in her pocket and her phone in airplane mode. Even her footsteps, rubber soles on carpet, learned to go quietly. Oddness began where small details are supposed to pass unnoticed. The inspection certificate in her favorite car bore a neat blue stamp and a signature, L. Harrow, with a loop in the H so smooth, it looked like someone practiced it every day in third-period history. A faint scratch ran through the letter O in the word load, as if a ring had tapped the plastic at some point and left a comet of damage. Twice, she watched her reflection in the car's polished side panel lift its hand a breath after she did, then hurry to catch up so that both were the same again. The difference was so slight a tired mind could dismiss it, and she did. But she remembered. Cleaners whispered among themselves in the break room about a mezzanine. Not the usual M for mechanical in a utility building, not a balcony, but a floor that did not appear on directories or keycards. "My cousin wrote it," said one, chewing a sandwich. "Up past 19, down past 9, and there it was, a letter between numbers like it didn't know where to live." Someone laughed. Someone else shrugged. The oldest cleaner, who had worked through 2 name changes and 3 property managers, said nothing and tapped ash into a paper cup that had no coffee in it. The night Mara first saw it, rain pushed steady lines down the glass of the lobby like someone drawing with a soft pencil. The car's light was a kind of narrow afternoon in a box. She leaned on the rail with the outer side of her forearm, the place where skin notices when cold comes in, and watched the panel count up. 12, 13, 14. The short chime at each stop was soft and well-mannered. Then, between 17 and 18, a letter lit. M. Not the pale green of the rest, but a warmer amber. As if it came from a filament bulb no one had replaced in decades. The doors opened onto a corridor that should not have fit. It was narrower than any hallway in the building, floored in linoleum with a pattern of gray squares worn to rounded corners. Along the baseboards ran a dark strip of scuff, as though carts had passed there so often the mark had become a kind of rail line. Lights hummed without complaining. A brass directory hung crooked on the far wall, but the glass over it was frosted with age and not quite transparent. Listings swam beneath like fish under thin ice. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings and warm paper. She did not step out. She stood in the doorway and felt the car's floor under her feet, a firm promise. The doors tried to close and could not. Not in the way an out-of-calibration sensor fusses, not in the hesitant electronic pulse of a safety edge that has brushed a sleeve and declares it. The panels moved with intention to the halfway point, and then paused, gently, as a person pauses when a second person arrives at the doorway at the same moment. Mara stepped back. The doors remained open. She held the close button and felt its rubber skin give under her thumb. The doors stayed. When she lifted her thumb, the panels moved a little again, then returned to their patient pause. Somewhere down the strange hall, a bell rang twice. Small, like a bicycle bell wrapped in felt. She let the elevator wait. The habit of her work told her that sometimes not acting is a kind of action. She watched the threshold and saw nothing pass except air. The carpet twisted a single fiber. The rail under her fingers grew faintly warm the way metal does when touched by an extra hand you cannot see. After a minute, maybe two, the panels finally agreed to close. The car lifted with its usual confidence. The M fell away. 18 lit. She found the leak detection kit she had meant to deliver past 19, and did not think about the fact that her heart had tried a faster rhythm for those few breathless seconds. An index card waited for her the next night, tucked into the seam where the doors met. It had been folded in half and left so that the fold showed, neat as a note passed in class. She removed it with 2 fingers. The paper was the kind that makes a dry whisper under a thumb. In careful ink, the words were written, "Please keep the door open for the mail cart." The handwriting had the curves of subway tiles and the kind of discipline given by ledgers and minutes. Impatient not at all, asking as if no one would think to refuse. She turned the card over. On the back, a line of small numbers ran like a schedule. 112, 240, 4, 3, 8. The building had no mail at those hours. The lobby had locked its revolving doors after 11. Couriers came before that with coats still dripping from scooters. The internal mailroom kept workday time, yet the idea of a mail cart at night did not disturb anything in her. It seemed as natural as the way rain finds seams in the pavement and remembers old paths to the river. She placed the card in the pocket of her shirt and kept moving. When the clock struck 1, 12 inches its digital way from the display on her phone, she happened to be in the East Bank again. The letter appeared with the same modest amber light. She held the doors. Something passed. Not something that could be seen. The elevator's air pressure ticked as if another body had joined it and left. A soft sound rolled along the threshold like paper sliding off a stack and being caught just in time. Her shirt sleeve lifted a little, moved by the kind of breeze created when a small thing goes past with purpose. The invisible weight did not hit sensors or make numbers climb on the car's load display. It simply went about its route. When it had gone, the car accepted that the world could resume and did. She delivered a box of replacement exit signs and wrote in the log that the south stairwell's light flickered and would prefer attention. A stray lived somewhere in the building's good graces. It had arrived one July with a calm, small face and remained. The guards called it Latch because it could hook a paw around a lever handle and let itself into a warm room, not to cause trouble but to look out the window as if absorbing the city through whiskers. Latch sometimes followed Mara for half an hour at a time, sitting squarely just outside wherever she worked, tail answering slowly like a clock's second hand. The cat rode the elevator without complaint. When M lit, Latch watched the doorway with interest. Ears turned to catch a noise that her hearing did not offer. There was no hiss, no arched back, no fear, only attention. It felt like permission. The smell came next, not strong, not even persistent. It arrived like a memory you cannot place. The air in the car would tilt toward graphite and glue, toward raincoats hung to dry, toward the gloss of magazines leafed with careful hands. Then it would pass, leaving a clean nothing behind. After that, she stopped pretending to herself that the card had been for anyone else. At a quiet hour, she set her card aside and looked up the building's old tenants in a digitized archive sent by a clerk who appreciated good questions. There, in a photograph with edges that had once cut a finger, sat a newsroom on floors 16 through 20. Archer and Crane evening. Men in ties, women in skirts, everyone with a pencil, everyone looking as if they had learned to care very quickly about what they were asked to say. Anton, the guard with the calm walk, found Mara reading the printout by the plants that wanted more south light than they got. They had a mezzanine, he said without being prompted, as if he had expected someone to ask someday. Narrow walkway between the east and west banks. This was before my time. They ran proofs down it at night to the presses below. When the paper sold and the presses moved, the walkway was boxed, covered, folded into other things. But buildings don't forget their shortcuts. He scratched Latch between the shoulders until the cat stretched one leg in appreciation. Someone left me a card once too. Said, "If you leave the door open, it will not knock." Knock? Mara asked, soft. He smiled, the smile of a person who doesn't want to alarm and doesn't want to pretend. "You'll know it if you decide not to help," he said. "It's not a threat, more a reminder. The way a radiator taps when air wants to pass." He showed her his own card, kept under the thick plastic of his badge, the way a child keeps a leaf pressed between pages. The same handwriting, the same sense that asking was the better part of any haunting. When the storm came, it wore a steady coat, no theatrical crashes, just rain that established a fact and kept to it. Roof drains sang in their round metallic throats. The letter M appeared 3 times before 2 in the morning, each time waiting with the patience of someone holding a door in a foyer while wind tried to make mischief. Mara did what she had been asked to do. She held the close button and let the doors fail to obey. She stood slightly to the side so that whatever hurried through could go level. Latch flicked an ear without moving otherwise, as if counting the passes. At 2:44, the car's floor vibrated faintly under the pads of her boots, the kind of hum that a well-oiled wheel makes when it knows the floor, and the floor knows it. She tried not helping once. The idea took hold the way contrary ideas do sudden, not based on any dislike, only on a wish to test the edges of a thing. The letter came. She did not stop. She closed the door, and kept it closed with a hand that was firmer than it needed to be. The car rose. Between floors, the world considered. The elevator stilled. Lights dimmed to a thoughtful level. No rattling, no worrying groan. Simply a pause so absolute it seemed to rearrange the space behind her eyes. For one measured minute, the building did nothing. Then the car resumed and delivered her with its usual courtesy. She stood looking at the panel and said into the polite silence, "All right." It was a lesson taken without scolding. She did not refuse again. On another night, the corridor beyond the M stretched farther. The lights bloomed more yellow, as though someone had put shades over them to save the eyes of typists. She thought, though, she could not be certain that she heard a voice reading aloud, not words she could catch, only the cadence of commas and the gentle lift of quotations. It had the same feeling as a neighbor's radio at a volume that says, "This is for me, not for you." A shadow slid along the wall at the height a cart handle would make. As it passed, a brass corner caught the light and flashed. The cat, who did not care for many shiny things, made a small sound of respect and did nothing else. In the seam where brushed steel panels meet the frame, she found a pin one morning. The cleaner's light caught it. Its head had the dull shine of brass that has known many pockets, stamped with Archer and Crane night floor. The pin's clasp was one of those old-fashioned ones that use their own angle to stay closed. She took it down to the front desk and placed it in the lost and found box with care. The next night it sat again in the elevator rail, the way a lapel pin leans when someone forgets to fasten it. She left it there. That evening, the car ran smoother than usual. Not in any measurable way, just in the way one notices when a habitual hitch refuses to appear. Deadlines are a reality even for people who tidy after others have made their decisions. A string of sensors needed to be placed on 27 before a test that would happen before dawn, and she planned her route as if plotting a small expedition. The letter arrived at 1:58, inconvenient and precise. She calculated. To hold the doors would take a minute, maybe two. To ignore would risk a pause she could not afford. She held the cart that practical imaginary passed with the same quiet confidence as ever, leaving behind a ribbon of cool air. She reached 27 minutes behind and found water pooling along the carpet outside the west mailroom. A window below had taken on rain faster than it could send it away. She dammed the flow with absorbent sleeves, called it in, marked red tape to keep footsteps from sharing the damp. When the day shift arrived, the hall was dry. For once, a delay had not been a delay. Modernization came the way it always does, with bright brochures, neat timelines, and the promise of a future built to worry less. The West Bank was shut down for a week. The East would follow. Panels were replaced. Buttons shed their rubber skins and entered a glossy era. Free coffee appeared briefly for tenants who had to wait a little longer for rides. The letter did not show itself during those nights. The car ran like a new thought, smooth and a little sterile. Mara did her rounds and looked nowhere for any corridor that could not exist. Latch slept on a folded drop cloth near the plant room and opened one eye when she passed, then closed it again, as if refusing to be involved in administrative decisions. The first time M returned after that, it did so with reserve, as if checking to see whether anyone remembered how courtesy worked. The light on the panel was fainter, its color more like a memory than a bulb. Mara held the doors. The air in the car cooled delicately, the way it does when a door opens briefly on a stairwell, where concrete keeps an old winter. She unclipped the brass pin and set it on the floor just outside the threshold, the way a person places a token in a tray to say, "I have been here and I am willing." When the panels closed, the pin was gone. She did not see it again. The letter visited less and less, but when it did, it always seemed in step with the clock on her phone to the exact minute accounted for on the card. On her last week of nights before a schedule change moved her into daylight, she took the elevator with a kind of farewell in her posture. The building felt different in those hours when she had usually been home and asleep. It did not dislike her, but it did not know her in the same way. She made one more circuit, checked the old hinges on the east stair, jotted a note about a buzz and an exit sign that had started to sing. At 12:41, as the lights of another city block blinked and settled and reflections made new windows where there were none, the letter appeared. Mara held the doors open the way a person holds a gate for someone walking in the rain. There was a pause, and then the soft sense of bustle passing through. It felt companionable, like standing to the side on a narrow street, while a small parade finds its route. Latch's tail drew a single line of contentment through air. The elevator's panel did not spell words. It only let its glow change in a way that made sense to anyone who has ever watched machines try to say thank you without letters. When the car closed and lifted, the new buttons clicked like distant ice cubes settling in a glass. She rode to the lobby and put her hand flat for a moment on the brushed metal, the way one pats a shoulder without saying anything else. People later said, in the manner of people who do not ask for certainty, that the East Bank sometimes lingers at night, not as a fault, but as a sigh. They say the air occasionally smells of pencil graphite, which is a practical nothing, and that the rail grows warm when held exactly long enough for a page to be turned in a book. A rumor says that if a person rides alone around 244 and does not hurry, the doors will pause of their own will and make room for a thing that affects nothing and is affected by nothing except kindness. Not all haunts are warnings. Some are rehearsals so well practiced they become a building's bedtime, the way a hush finds a room after a story ends and remains there. Not because anything is wrong, but because something once mattered very much and keeps to its schedule. Story number 3. After hours, the conservatory refused to sleep in the way stone buildings do. Glass does not drowse. It collects the dark and returns it in softened shapes. The big house of palms and ferns at the edge of the park sat like a ship pulled onto land, ribs of iron painted white, panes crowding each other in frames that held 100 winters and summers without complaint. In the day, children pressed faces to the glass and fogged it with breath. At night, the lamps along the path threw a honeyed haze across the panes, and from inside came the sound of water thinking about falling. Iris kept the night watch when a weather system threatened extremes. She was trained for plant science and patience in equal measure. The job, in storms and heat waves, was to mind humidity and temperature, to keep each room's small climate in the narrow band that kept delicate leaves from bruising at the edges. There was a logbook on a high table near the palm house door, where she wrote in pencil, "Fog on North Panes squeegeed. Timer set to pulse. Ridge vents tested. The logbook smelled faintly of loam and graphite. Her handwriting kept neatly to lines as if drawn by a ruler no one could see. The greenhouse had its neighborhoods. The fernery was a low room tucked under a pitch like a shade held over the quiet. The desert house sat with its gravel and spines, and careful dry. The palm house was taller than it looked from the outside, because height is a kind of trick with glass. Heat collected at the top and moved like a slow animal. The paths were brick, worn smooth where many shoes had chosen to drift toward the benches. Tiny brass labels on spikes announced names that sounded like spells or the names of stars. Nephrolepis exaltata, Asplenium nidus, Phoenix robolinii, First Oddness. A tag turned to face where no one stood. Iris did not notice when it happened. She was walking past with the long-handled hose, counting breaths between mists to keep rhythm in her wrists. When she paused to roll the hose on its wheel, the tag for a rare filmy fern had rotated in the potting soil. The spike had not moved. It had simply decided to aim its message at the path. The plant, frail as lace, shed no water. She corrected the label and put the change in the log. Second, in the cool house, where alpine plants kept a little winter to themselves, the pane above the oldest trough frosted from the inside in midsummer, just a thin veil that gave back the shape of a leaf. She ran a finger over it and made a clear streak, then watched her line close again with new, fine crystals like careful handwriting. She stood for a long time and watched the frost draw and redraw itself in curves that suggested a thing more like a blueprint than a decoration. When it melted, the glass held the memory a faint map of lines like the trace left by dried rain. The maintenance crew had taken the old boiler offline. Its brick-sided belly sat as a polite antique in a room of newer things. Even cold, it sang when weather shifted. Pipes exhaled. Valves made tiny acknowledgments like birds correcting their perches. Iris listened to the building the way she listened to plants, without needing to believe anything particular. When vents opened with a slow sigh, when the soil in a bench smelled of pepper and old leaves, when the desert house woke like a cat in sun, all of it added up to the kind of presence a person can keep company with. On the third night of heat, humidity numbers on her handheld meter began to drift from their expected order. The palm house asked for a little more mist. The fernery asked for less. She adjusted timers and slid open the narrow ridge vents at the top with the old crank that always seemed too slight for the height it commanded. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a slow fall of something along the far wall. Not water. A page. She crossed the brick with her steps barely, sounding over the sleepers of the structure. The page lay face down. When she turned it over, she found not a page, but a card. The kind that lives in old seed drawers. It was printed with tidy lines for date, origin, and treatment. The handwriting was exact, a pencil sharpened to a needle. Lodoicea borrowed humidity to be held high overnight return in the morning. Lodoicea did not live in the collection. It was a name Iris knew from the back of books about Far Palms, the double coconut with fruit-like stories. She checked the seed bank's modern database. The name belonged in an index, not on a live sheet in the palm house. The card's paper, when held, felt neither brittle nor new. It felt like something kept safe where fingers are careful. She let the card rest on the table by the log and did the thing that came simplest. She attended to the numbers. She set the misters to fine mist, longer intervals, a feathery rain that would hang in the air and not bruise. She turned the vents to a narrow breath. Midnight arrived like a thought. Just after, the glass began to make a sound like a jacket being shaken out and hung by a window. She looked up. The panes around the central aisle purled along their lower edges, little beads coalescing into lines. A narrow trickle shaped itself precisely along an old path on the brick, curving to avoid a spot that had sunk just enough to hold a thumbprint of water. The conservatory remembered too many nights for coincidence. On the fourth night, she found an envelope folded small under the lip of the workbench sink. No stamp. No seal. Inside, a hand-drawn chart of the palm house's ceiling vents with numbers next to them that were not current settings. In the bottom margin, the faint remainder of a thumb's dirt left a smudge with the shapes of 3 tiny seeds pressed into the paper, as if kept in a pocket and briefly forgotten. She put the current readings beside the old ones in the log. She set the vents accordingly for an hour at a time, and, between the houseplants and the delicate mysteries, felt something in the building ease its shoulders. In one corner, a wrought iron gate had been welded long ago to keep visitors from climbing a staircase that led nowhere since a walkway had been removed. The gate's pattern made a series of loops like handwriting with no letters. In the heat, the metal warmed and cooled and clicked, a shy kind of music. As the nights went stranger, the cadence of those clicks shifted and began to mark time with the old charts. When the gate clicked twice and kept quiet, the misters began their gentle fall. When the clicking became a long, even spacing like footfalls on a wooden bridge, the vents closed a fraction and held. Iris smiled without knowing she had done so. At 3:11 on a night when everything else would have chosen to sleep, the fernery, which had not asked for fuss, hissed once. A thin fog rushed from a vent that had not opened. It spread a breath and stopped. The cause was not mechanical. The manual readouts held steady. She walked through the fog and watched hair on her arms lift, as though the greenhouse itself had run a cool hand along her skin to get her attention. On the bench where the collection of primitive ferns sat in their low trays, drops gathered along a wooden edge in a swallow's neat line. She held her hand there and felt a pulse, not a heartbeat, more like the way a room hums when a refrigerator starts in a quiet house 2 rooms away. The path to the palm house was familiar. She could walk it with her eyes closed and know where the brick would lift and where it would settle. That night, the distance felt subtly longer, not stretched like a nightmare, not a trick of fear, just the sensation of one extra step between ivy and ladder, between ladder and door. A narrow door she had never noticed showed itself near the base of the great cycad. It was painted the same green as everything else and carried the words Palm Annex on a sign whose paint had paled to a whisper. She put a hand on the knob. It was cool. The way iron that does not mind a night is cool. She turned, and the door opened onto a corridor that would not fit in any plan. The corridor was tight, not unfriendly, floored in brick, laid on edge so a shoe could find grip. Along one wall ran a bench, soft with old water stains. Above, narrow panes let in a moon not present in the actual sky. She recognized no plant along the bench, just outlines and suggestions. The silhouettes of palms that looked like drawn hands held up to say, wait. A tag lay on the bench, heavy and oval, stamped with a number, and the ghosts of letters rubbed thin. Her own reflection in the pane above came to her a fraction late, as if the glass wanted her to become used to it first. She went as far as the brass railing that guarded an open shaft where air rose, clean and new. She did not step beyond it. A rule lived in a place like this: go far enough to learn the edge, not far enough to misplace your common sense. She watched a little while as something that could have been a leaf or a gloved hand adjusted a tag and set steam to the lightest thread. When she turned, the door was behind her, where the door should be. She wrote in the log what she could write. She did not include the wrench of her heart at the sight of someone having lived here in the spaces between panes, someone whose handwriting drew its own horizon. She returned the seed card to the bench where she had found it, though she erased the word borrowed and, in a smaller hand, wrote, returned, with a question mark as polite as she could make it. When she returned at dawn to check on the moisture, the card had moved 2 inches to the left. It wasn't proof. It was enough. When she told the head horticulturist in cautious language, numbers and charts and not much else, the older woman nodded, as if Iris had asked for the right hose nozzle. We kept a cycad alive through a winter before they insulated this place properly, she said. There was a man then who could read the glass from the path. He'd point to a pane and say, that one is thinking of making a puddle. We teased him about it, then learned to listen when he looked at the sky and didn't speak for a minute. Some people can see a room decide. The storm broke in a straight line. Rain came down sideways because wind likes to pretend it can argue with gravity and win. Iris stayed in the palm house through the worst of it. Water ran in the gutters overhead, sounding like distant applause. She kept the misters quiet and the vents a finger's width open, and the glass shook gently and did not complain. Just past 3:11, as the numbers would later claim, the sound changed. Not louder, not a gust, just a different conversation between water and roof. The frost map on the cool house pane drew itself again, unseasonable, lovely, then stopped mid-curve as if paused for breath. Something had lodged in the drain by the big traveler's palm. It could have been a leaf, but leaves behave differently when they agree to be a problem. This was more like a small, Stubborn idea. Iris knelt and slid her gloved fingers into the water where it swirled. Her fingertips found a shape like the corner of a coin. She lifted it into the light. Not metal. A seed shell, brittle but intact, with a faint seam like a smile. She set it in a clean tray lined with damp paper, and used the fine brush she kept for spider mites to ease the grit from its edges. On the shell, when it dried, was a pencil number so faint she saw it only when she shielded the overhead light. 17. The seed bank drawers on the far wall held tiny time capsules, glassine envelopes sleeping like moths under labels. Iris looked for 17 and found a gap where an envelope had once lived and did not now. In the ledger bound in oilcloth next to it, in the spine where dates climb, a thin, precise entry showed for that number, Lodoicea trial lost to drain, and then a line through the word lost so fine and exact it made the correction softer, not lost. She did not think she had brought anything into being by looking. She did not need to. The conservatory had chosen to return the thing to the bench where a person willing to bend and get wet would find it. She packed the shell the way one might pack a charm and put a note in the seed bank's new system so no one's diligent order would step on older forms of care. She left the tray under the old boiler's flue, where gentle warmth rose. She signed the log with her name and wrote, in her tidy hand, in small print, as the glass held it. Holding high overnight. Return in the morning. After that, the oddness did not end. It learned not to push. The frost returned only on certain nights when the sky had that particular blankness that makes sound travel farther than it should. The gate clicked in phrases. The misters took their breath when the number in her head said they would. The narrow door behind the cycad stayed where it had always stayed by not appearing. By letting the brain choose brick and fern over a corridor that did not fit a plan. If she passed by with less sleep than she liked, if the weather built its machine again, if the vents sighed from heat, she would feel her way of stepping change to the stride of someone else, someone who had walked that path when benches were new and seed cards were freshly cut. She did not try to hold his gait or to step out of it. She allowed the overlap and then let it pass. On her last night keeping the numbers through a weather watch, a boy pressed his hands to the palm house glass from the outside. His parents stood back under an umbrella and pretended to scold him by saying his name softly. He said, "It's raining inside." Not as a complaint, but as a piece of wonder given to anyone who could accept it. Iris stood on the interior path and lifted a hand to his. The glass made their palms equal. Behind the boy, the park lamps shaved gold into puddles. Behind Iris, the misters whispered over a bench where a tray sat with a repaired history. In the days that followed, docents found that the story of the double coconut had acquired a new line about a seed that had almost been lost and was not. They did not say anything about the corridor or the frost maps, or the way the railings sometimes grew warm against the hand when the mist was exactly what it should be. They only said, "Watch the glass at night. It remembers rain even when the sky forgets." People later said that if you walked the path outside the palm house after closing on a still evening, you could hear a version of rain happening under glass when the sky above you held none. They said the smell of pencil shavings sometimes arrived by the door near the cycad, and that, if a person lingered with respectful quiet, a tag might turn slightly to include your eye, as if asking you to read and remember on behalf of something that once mattered and, in the right humidity, still does. Story number 4. They called it the ghost light because every stage has one. A single bare bulb on a tall stand with a heavy base, rolled to center after the last person leaves. It keeps a glow in the dark, so ankles don't find the edge of the orchestra pit and hands don't mistake an open trap for solid floor. The light at the Hartwell Playhouse was old brass with a cord that had learned the shape of the stage. Its wheels knew every plank. When the house went quiet, exit signs the only punctuation, velvet curtains breathing very slightly, this not quite daylight made a small island on the boards and told the room it was not entirely alone. May kept the late hours when renovations ran into the small ones and productions leaned toward opening nights. She knew the sound of dimmer racks at rest, the soft, almost musical hiss of sprinklers beyond the ceiling, the way sandbags in the fly tower settled with polite complaints. Her hands had splinters in the places every stage manager earned splinters. She loved the little practicalities. The chalk lines that map a room no one else sees, the way gaffer tape hems a scene so a chair knows where to sit, the click of a cue light coming to life and, later, admitting that's enough. She made her rounds after the carpenters stacked their tools, and the last actor's laughter dissolved into coat sleeves and umbrellas. Stage door bolted. Fire curtain clear. Trap latches set. She rolled the ghost light out and let its halo draw a quiet circle across center. The bulb's filament drew one thread of gold and held it steady. It looked right. She went to the booth to check the light board's sleep mode and returned to find the stand no longer on center. It was not far 2-3 inches to downstage, but different enough that her eye, tuned to marks, felt the wrongness like a sock twisting inside a boot. She chalked a small X where the wheel had been. The chalk made that soft, good sound that once belonged to classrooms. Then she rolled the light back to center, checked the cord for a snag, and stood with hands on hips, listening to the proscenium breathe. The gold thread hummed. The theater, satisfied, kept its counsel. A week later, she found 3 X's, her original and 2 more, fainter, as if an eraser had tried to help, and then changed its mind. The stand sat precisely at the newest mark, which leaned a little toward stage left. She put a hand on the upright. It was warm the way a handrail is warm when a person has just gone by. She looked up. The rigging ropes hung like script too tall to read. A cue light at the stage manager's desk glowed the faintest ember red, though the mains were off. She checked the switch. Off. She checked the feed. Dead. The light persisted in its low sleep, as if remembering something. "Standing by," she said softly to the room, not to anyone in it. A small feeling in her chest eased, the way it does when a thing finds its old place and settles back in. Over the next nights, the ghost light learned to choose. Some evenings it stayed in its ordinary place, an obedient sun at the stage's dead center. On others, it shifted to the lip of the apron, that braver edge above the unseen seats. Once it settled between 2 taped marks left from a rehearsal pink and blue like a neutral guest at a quarrel. May tried the rational possibilities. The stage was not level. The base had developed a tiny wobble. The cord was tugging on a splinter or a nail. She replaced the wheel casters. She rewired the plug. Regardless, the light took up its position with the decision-making of an old dog choosing where to sleep. Backstage, near a wall of spattered paint and ancient show posters, an older prompt book waited in a drawer with a stubborn slide. It had come with the building in the way some tools do. No one remembers acquiring them. No one would discard them. May had flipped through it once in a slow hour and found, in careful pencil, the old calls that belonged to any theater written in a hand with loops that leaned forward. Half hour, 15, places. It held blocking notes for a season's worth of plays whose names had gone out of fashion, arrows and crosses and exclamation marks that looked more like dedications than instructions. In the margin beside a page marked "Change to Night," she found a line so faint she had to tilt the paper to see it. Someone had written, in very small letters, "If trap is open, leave the lamp at the lip." She looked at the page number. She looked at the stage. She thought of her chalk X's and of the apron's edge where the bulb sometimes lingered with its quiet coin of light. She checked the trap. It was latched. She tapped the latch with a knuckle, the way people establish a hello with things built to hold. The metal answered with that particular note old metal has, both hollow and confident. Contractors came during the day to install new drapes over the balcony entrances, softening echoes. At night, May thought she heard steps in the balcony when she knew she shouldn't. Not brisk, not intruding. Simply the idea of someone walking down a row of seats carefully, counting quietly for a cue she was not yet ready to give. The ghost light's halo touched dust in the air and made the dust look like stars in a jar. The auditions for a youth showcase filled the dressing rooms with warm chaos, brushes and belts and shoe bags, smelling faintly of rosin and perfume. May believed in both kindness and rules, the two halves of running a stage. She told the kids not to run. She told them to keep off the apron unless invited. She taped a neat, bright line a foot from the pit and said, "This side is yours." The ghost light, however, had opinions. It would not roll cleanly away for the afternoon rehearsals. Twice it drifted back a handspan after she'd parked it downstage right, where it would be safely useless. She left it lit behind a black traveler drape, as if it had its own rehearsal to attend. In the hush between takes when the kids stopped testing runs and the piano waited, with its cover closed, May heard a headset click to life. She knew the sound the way a firefighter knows his pager. It was the small pop a belt pack makes when someone breathes near an open mic. Except every pack sat neatly on its hooks, charging lights green. "Stand by," she said from habit, and felt foolish, and then felt less foolish when a cue light in the wings went from dark to the faintest suggestion of red and back again. The way a heartbeat makes a brief decision about continuing. Rain wrote it slow cursive across the city one night, and stayed to see what it had said. The roof above the grid listened, and found no leaks worth announcing. The ghost light rolled itself toward the apron with a steadiness May might have called stubbornness if metal could be stubborn. She watched it wheel, slow, sure, and come to rest inches from her bright tape. She crouched and put a fingertip to the tape line the way one learns the temperature of bath water. She thought of the prompt book's whisper about the trap. She opened the trap and found, not danger, but uncertainty. The latch engaged as it should, but the brace had worked loose from a day's worth of footfalls and vibration. It would hold unless someone trusted it too much, unless someone put a heel on its edge because a song pulled them forward. She repaired it, and set a proper sign, and felt a wash of relief so clean it made her almost lightheaded. "Thank you," she said to the light. The bulb hummed. A fly rope that had been complaining gently since sundown sighed into silence. On a different night, she set the seat numbers straight in the center row. People nudged numerals without noticing. At seat C12, the brass number had a tiny scratch through the C, the way a ring once scratches a piano lid. She felt the itch of memory, and could not place it. House lights were at ghost. The bulbs in the chandelier wore their thin frost. In the quiet that builds when the last lock clicks and the last foot leaves, she heard a whispering, not of voices, but of cloth settling. It sounded like the audience forging itself in the dark, coats coming to terms with their hooks, programs finding lap level. The intercom on the wall by the stage manager's desk, the one that had no power unless she gave it some, spoke with one breath. Not a word. The sound of a person about to speak and deciding not to. She put a hand on the handset, the kind that feels different from the way cell phones feel because it was built to stare at a wall and wait for instructions. She did not lift it. She didn't need to. The breath belonged to a rhythm the room knew. A touring company borrowed the stage for a week to run a ballet with clever sets that moved like puzzles. On the first night, a load-in tech swore he saw the ghost light standing at the upstage door when he arrived in the dawn, though the door was locked from the inside, and the light would have had to pass a set of stairs to get to that spot. He considered working that into a story, and then kept it as a private small thing the day had given him. The company's stage manager, a woman with a scar on her eyebrow that made her seem perpetually focused, asked if they could leave the ghost light on while they ran transitions. "Superstition," she said, not embarrassed, simply stating a basic fact like asking where the coffee was. May said yes. During the cue to cue, time slowed the way it does in theaters, not because nothing is happening, but because the happening is contained and exact. The ghost light's halo crossed the floor when scenery did. It stood near the wings when the deck crew had a moving piece with a hidden corner. It kept to center when a dance covered the stage, and made kids taller than they were during the day. One dancer, new and anxious, ran beyond his mark in a blackout to make an entrance on the other side. Mind full of counts that braided in his head, he cut the corner of the pit hard, trusting a darkness he didn't yet understand. The ghost light, left burning low in a corner, brightened, not in a surge but in a practical way, as if someone had opened a dimmer, a quarter inch. It drew a narrow, sudden edge on the floor where black met drop. The dancer put a hand out at that bright tongue, felt the edge of it, and checked. He later did not recall seeing the light change. He remembered only a strange, small certainty that he should put his hand out, and he did. May watched from the desk and felt the kind of gratitude that makes the mouth dry. There were other kindnesses. The night a hinge on a trap began to complain, the ghost light nudged an inch to look in that direction and hummed until someone paid attention. The afternoon a novice stagehand taped an X where a chair should be, and forgot to pull the tape when the scene moved. The light ended up squarely covering that X, and the director made a joke about actors learning not to sit on lights. A snowstorm quieted the city so that the only cars moving were those with obligations. The theater had its own weather then, a hush-like paper inside a drawer. The ghost light's cord made a new path across the floor, avoiding a damp spot that had not formed yet but would. May tried very carefully not to become fanciful. She did not invite danger to make the story better. She did her checks with the same seriousness she had before wheels developed minds and bulbs took on moods. but she could not ignore the way the ghost light behaved, as if it understood both space and time the way stage managers do. Practical magic, measured to the second and the inch. Near the end of the youth showcase's run, a storm outside ran out of patience and shoved a gust down the alley so that the stage door gave its frame a good thump without opening. The air on stage pressed forward and then let go in a body's exhale. The ghost light leaned a fraction and steadied. The headset, asleep on its hook, popped once. The cue lights gave their red kiss and withdrew. The safety rail at the pit, which had taken a day's worth of hands smoothly, quivered and settled. May happened to be at the prompt desk with a pencil between her fingers, and without thinking she said, "Places, low." From somewhere in the balcony, a seat creaked. Maybe a spring. Maybe just cloth shifting. But the sound fell in exactly the moment after the call would have ended in a full house. She sat a long time then, listening to an old building be present. It was not a haunting built for frights. It was steadier than that, the echo of competence, rehearsed work repeating itself long after the hands have changed. On closing night, flowers lay in vases along the lobby windows, stems cut on bias, petals still waking up from their wrapping. The show ran on applause like a well-tuned boiler on steam. After the curtain call, kids filed off with faces shining from effort and powder. May saw a glitter in the corner of her eye that was not dropped mascara or reflective tape. In the wings, leaning against the wall by the map of the fire exits, a brass plaque she had not noticed before reflected the ghost light's glow. She stepped closer. It named a stage manager from long ago, the kind of quiet memorial management orders when someone's years end without fanfare, for keeping the room safe enough for stories. The dates were from a time when smoke curled in the lobby lamps and velvet held other perfumes. She rolled the ghost light to center and tugged the cord straight, and felt the stage underfoot answer with its particular hollow kindness. She left the house light at a warm shade. She went around checking what needed checking, and then came back to the stand. The bulb pulsed once, just a minute change, the smallest wink. She could have convinced herself she imagined it. She chose not to. She placed a fingertip on the stand, returned its little gesture. The metal was warm again, as if someone else had just done the same. Later, people said the Hartwell's ghost light preferred the apron on wet nights and kept obedient center in winter. They said if you stopped by the stage door and leaned on the yawning hinge, you could hear applause inside the steel, a memory stored in mechanics. They said that on one seat in the fourth row, the cushion warmed a touch more than its neighbors while the light burned, as if a person had just stood up or was about to sit down. And if a person with keys and late work to do stood alone on the boards and whispered, "Standing by," they would see a cue light breathe faintly. In answer, a small red dot, like the heartbeat of the room itself, saying, "Yes. Waiting. Ready when you are." It never frightened anyone who respected tape lines and lived their life by calls. It humbled some, made others kinder. The thing people found most unsettling was not a scream in the empty house or a footstep overhead. It was the feeling that the show kept itself, that the stage knew how to take care even when no one was looking, that a small light understood the difference between quiet and silence, and chose the former so that the latter would not have to. Story number 5. Behind the library, the sundial kept its watch on a square of gravel and time. It had a bronze face rubbed bright, where fingers touched the motto, and a slender gnomon that threw proper shadows during proper hours. The inscription said, "I count only the sunny hours," as if night had nothing worth remarking. Lamps along the brick path made small islands in the dark. After closing, the windows in the stacks reflected the garden as a softer version of itself, and kept the stars at arm's length. Nina worked the late inventory shifts when the budget asked for hours no one else had. She liked the quiet policies of the building heat that lowered its voice at 10, the careful hum of the climate cabinet where the older maps slept, the programmed sigh of the copy machine settling itself. She wrote in a narrow ledger with a pencil sharpened to a point that remembered school. Gutter checks, cart returns, shelf read in travel, wiped condensation off north panes. She propped the delivery door and rolled the returns bin in so the metal lip wouldn't clatter and wake the birds in the eaves. The first oddness was not dramatic. On a night that offered no moon, and a sky like velvet with a thumb pressed into it, the sundial cast a shadow, not a smudge from the path light, not a trick from a distant porch, a thin, decisive line that lay across the gravel, and pointed at the book drop like the minute hand settling between ticks. Nina paused on the threshold with a tote of biographies and looked from the dark to the shadow and back. A gust curled the time against its low border. The shadow held steady. She found herself stepping a little lighter as she crossed. Inside, the returns bin held a tilt of paperbacks that would have slid if the lip had been left open all evening. Tucked behind the flap, thin and patient, was a thick volume in a gray library jacket, long absent. The stamp sheet inside showed 3 decades of dates, and then a gap. No name, just a line. She felt its weight, and thought of hands that meant to bring it back. Until the day got busy, and another day arrived, and so on. She signed it into the ledger, and did not write anything about shadows. The next night, the line lay at a new angle, as if the day were creeping over a different horizon. It pointed at the far end of fiction, where a shelf ran a fraction out of square. She followed because the muscles in her legs made the decision for her. The smell back there, a warm mix of paper and carpet, said the building breathed out slowly for itself in the absence of anyone who needed oxygen explained to them. On the bottom shelf, spines stood neatly except for one book pushed back just enough to add a dark to the line. Behind it lay a pair of reading glasses in a case with a soft wool sleeve. She slid them out and set them at the desk where people ask about interlibrary loans. In the morning, an anxious smile would stand there. She tried making it obey physics. She turned the lamp by the bench and tilted its head, held her phone's flashlight and swept slow arcs like a stagehand searching for a mark. The sundial's shadow did not care. It came from no bulb Nina could name, stayed slender, and stretched with the calm of someone who knows there is time. It seemed to understand where edges met, the way a careful reader understands punctuation. In the old card catalog, at the end of a row of drawers that had not been opened in years, a finger-thick card stuck up out of sequence. She slid it free, and found a neat hand in pencil that preferred the left margin. Please shelve at once. Rain tonight. North Leak. The date was a winter from 30 years back. Between the stacks and the roof, not much had changed. Nina looked up at the ceiling tiles above the big table near local history, and saw the tiniest curve where a grid had learned to accept a burden. She set a bucket in the evening's shadow, and checked the roof at once, because up there time is both kinder and less forgiving. The hatch to the roof went easily, as if happy to be asked. The night put its hand on her hair, and smelled like damp concrete. Along the gravel roof, small puddles mapped the sky. Near the north drain, a collar of leaves had made a crown big enough to be proud of. She scooped it away, felt water go sleekly where it had been thinking too hard about decisions, and heard the satisfying glug of a pipe letting go. When she returned to the tiles below, the curve held, then unburdened. In the morning, the atlas table would be dry. Another night, the line on the sundial aimed as if trying to think around a corner. It fell across the children's room window and into the dim space where picture books slept in their bins like loaves cooling. Nina stood in the doorway and listened for anything like footsteps or paper breathing. The fish tank murmured to itself. The felt curtain of the puppet stage moved an inch and held, as if a small hand that did not intend mischief had decided to listen instead. The line had length now, a thing that wanted her to see into stacks where her keys could explain themselves. It stopped at a display case that held a circulating collection of oddities from the town. A teacher's bell from a one-room school, a pair of iron spectacles too heavy for a nose, a key whose tag had gone blank. She unlocked the glass and lifted the tray. Beneath a folded yellow clippings page lay a brass key with annex pressed into its head. The teeth were old-fashioned. Nina turned it in her palm and felt the skin between thumb and forefinger. Remember the motion of unlocking doors no one has asked to open in a while. Behind reference, where a partition had been built years ago to hide ducks and decisions, a green-painted door waited as if waiting were the thing it liked best. The key in the lock made that nice click that shows both machine and hand had agreed. The room beyond was narrow and taller than its door, full of old shelving and boxes printed with stamps from different administrations. Dust kept its own gentle rules. A ledger lay under a muslin cloth on a cart like a patient that does not want to be dramatic. She folded the cloth back and found a title written in a quiet fountain pen script. After Hours. Entries climbed pages in a hand that made numbers look like music. 1 6-drop slot wedged freed. 133 north drain cleared. 2 10 child's mitten under chair, placed in lost and found. 254 turn the book on the stand to page 74 avoids crease. A name signed at the bottom of each night, small, always with the same tidy flourish, and a decade that ended before Nina was born. She read for a long time because reading was a manner of listening. By the third page, she felt less alone, not in an unpleasant way, but in the widening sense that the building had learned to keep itself with help that did not need to be seen. On a night that waited for a storm to finish making up its mind, the sundial's shadow pointed over its own shoulder. It angled toward the plaque at the lowest corner of the garden, the one most people skipped because the time tidied it too well. Nina knelt and cleared away the plant's polite attempt to include the bronze in its business. The plaque named a head librarian from long ago and the shop that cast the dial, and beneath that, in a line of letters nearly gone, an orientation mark meant to set the gnomon true. Dirt filled one groove. She lifted it away with the corner of a card and read a date that had been misread when the sundial moved from the old town hall. Set by night sky, the line said. She sat back on her heels and smiled at a thing that refused to be literal. Inside, the line reached for the microfilm cabinet. She hadn't touched it in weeks. She rolled a tray open and heard the small chorus of sleeves whispering to each other. In the drawer where local notices slept, a film lay angled wrong, just enough to catch and crease next turn. She straightened it. The thread of the sundial's shadow lay across her knuckles, with a cool that carried no temperature in it, only attention. A minute later, the light on the microfilm reader blinked and steadied, the way a thing says thank you without language. Once she tested not following. The night was still, and the line pointed through the lobby toward the public bulletin board. She finished shifting a shelf and kept her hand on the cart longer than she needed to. The overheads hummed. The clock on the wall believed in itself. The building let her feel the difference without scolding. Air moved once, as if a door had opened far away. The coffee machine, which usually considered itself above opinion, clicked faintly. She placed the cart, turned back toward the bulletin board, and watched a poster Safety Seminar Thursday curl in one corner to reveal the corner of the electrical panel behind it. A warm spot there glowed just a little more than sense allowed. She called maintenance and wrote a note that did not sound like nerves, only attention. In the morning, a breaker would be replaced, and no one would know why the plastic had not had a bad night. The ledger in the annex grew, but not because she added fancy. She wrote times and addresses the way the previous hand had. 12:48 vent, humming cleaned filter. 122 dropped coin in copy machine return, stopped blinking. 231 brace in periodicals tightened no lean. She never signed her full name, only the initial, in deference to the privacy of the earlier pages. When she reached the back, a single line waited without being written yet. If the dial points to the old oak, ring twice and go upstairs. It was familiar enough to feel like memory. She rang the staff bell twice without drama. Upstairs, at the end of the hallway where donor portraits pretend to look at paintings, a window had been left unlatched by a cleaner who'd trusted friction. Wind worried it into a slow open and would have made a conversation with rain. She latched it and set a small wooden wedge there because people in windows like knowing they are not wholly responsible for themselves. On the windiest night, the line reached beyond the garden and past the far gate. The town lay under a weather that made trees sway like listeners disagreeing quietly. She followed to the older foundation stones of a school that had become a field. The lamps there burned modest. The line stopped at a low marker with letters worn to their patience. She rubbed soil away and found, under the date, a simple phrase, donated in memory of the keeper of hours. Not a name, a duty. It explained as much as it needed to. She packed dirt back around the stone with her hands and did not tell anyone in the morning because some things get larger if announced. After that, the sundial behaved like a friend who knows when to speak. Most nights it minded itself. On a few, the slender knot shadow cut across the gravel and through the glass and lay along a shelf like a bookmark placed in a hurry and with love. People said the library kept losing fewer things. A mitten stayed near its mate. A letter found its envelope after weeks. A wallet came back from between atlas volumes when it might have gone into a slot too narrow for hands. They said that if you sat by the garden after closing, the time would release a smell like someone opening an old pencil case and smiling. No one felt watched. They felt noticed. Nina kept the ledger. She left the annex key where it felt useful and not important. On her last night of that long season of quiet hours, she paused by the sundial and laid a hand on the bronze face. The metal felt the same as always and a little warmer, the way things get when words sit near them. The line lay nowhere. The garden belonged to the dark again. She did not need it to perform for her every time. The building had learned its shape with a little help. That was the unsettling comfort of it. The sense that even when eyes were tired and rooms were empty, something in the place kept count, not of sunny hours alone, but of what needed returning. Story number 6. At night, the dome felt like a held breath. Seats curved in tidy arcs, low red aisle lights stitched a quiet seam through darkness, and the old star projector iron ribs and lenses like a sea urchin made of clockwork rested on its pedestal with the gravity of an elder at ease. The city's glow pressed its soft oranges against the building's skin, but inside the planetarium the dark was deliberate, the kind that invites eyes to grow wider until the whole room seems to float. Noor kept watch during maintenance nights and meteor shower shows that ran late. She trusted the room the way one trusts a good instrument. Inspect, tune, and then let trellised habit hold. Her checklist lived on a clipboard with corners worn round by years of fingers. She moved through the small tasks that keep a world behaving: lens caps, focus rings, dimmers, vents. She liked the smell of dust warmed gently by transformers, the cushion of felt around the control levers, the soft tick from inside the Zeiss when a gear settled into its place like a thought returning. Oddness arrived as a dot where no dot should be. She was running a test sky, winter, northern hemisphere, a clean bowl of stars where each known point had its assigned temper. Above the horizon line, near the space between Auriga and Perseus, a faint grain winked once and then steadied. It wasn't bright enough to be boastful, not dim enough to forget. She checked the program file, no added objects. She checked the starball shutters closed where they should be. The dot remained, patient as a held note. The dome has a trick of making up its own distance, so she sat in the back row to triangulate. The stray star lowered itself, by illusion, until it seemed to ride a seat back in row G. Noor stood. The dot slid again, now hovering where the aisle jogged to meet the exit. She walked the aisle, eyes bouncing between ribboned red floor lights and the pale seat of light above. At the jog, the carpet lifted the minimum amount that makes a foot catch. A screw had shaken itself shy. The red strip light hid the bump's shadow just enough that a hurried step would find it. She radioed a note to the morning crew and took a small tool roll from her pocket. 1 turn. 2. The screw seated. The carpet smoothed. When she straightened, the dot above let go, winked, and faded out of the starry field as neatly as a well-timed blackout. Planetaria collect odd equipment the way theaters collect gaffer tape. In the control booth, beneath a drawer of spare fuses and fine brushes, Noor found a flat tin that once held biscuits and now kept star plates, a set of thin metal masks with constellations cut into them like lace. A paper label had peeled but clung. Zenith Old Program. In red pencil along one rim, someone had written little notes that were not cues so much as kindnesses. Lower Andromeda if the child cries. Let Cygnus drift until the murmurs quiet. Delay dawn for late arrivals. At 1:17, during another test run, the projector's internal motor made a hummingbird decision and advanced the sky by a barely noticeable degree. On the dome, it worked out to a breath of movement. On her schedule, it moved a blackout 5 seconds later than she had planned. The timing fell so that the house never reached true dark. The glow under seats stayed. The doors remained a suggestion. Her hand was on the dimmer. It felt like someone else's hand lightly covered hers and suggested, "Leave it there." She did. 30 seconds later, far across the building, a door latch thumped to admit a guard whose watch had lagged behind the hour. He stood in the doorway and apologized because polite guards do, and the room went on breathing. She started finding things. In the margin of an old script, a pencil circle around the name of a star that blinks in its own time. Algol, the old eye blinker. Next to it, a tiny arrow and the phrase, "Use this if a seat latch fusses." She didn't quite know how, until the latch at B9 began to loosen with a tick that would catch an ankle. She brought up Algol and let its soft, periodic dimming mark the beat while she tightened the screw in the half-light, all show, no shadowed wrench. The tiny star winked like an accomplice, and the seat stopped trying to have an opinion. Rumors said the planetarium had once been a music hall. The truth was gentler. It had been a lecture theater with a, Dome added later, A sky lowered over the bones of speeches and lantern slides. Above the dome, a catwalk ran like a line drawn with a ruled pencil, and a narrow door opened to a small square of night sky that techs used to sniff the weather with their faces. The roof hatch had a habit of pretending closed when it was not. On those nights, the faintest trickle of city orange would ghost itself into the dome during the darkest minute and draw a thin bruise around the baseboards. Noor was checking apertures when she noticed that the southwest quadrant's field was not quite true black. It had the tiniest wash, as if a hand had passed a candle behind a sheet. She paused the program, toggled sources, and saw the wash disappear only when she brought up the star field to its fullest scatter. In that blizzard of dots, a single thread of faint light pointed like a spear to the catwalk's ladder. She climbed. The hatch's dog handle lay askew by a degree no one else would call a degree. She set it. The city's insistence went to 0. When she came back down, she let the sky drift, and the faint wash vanished the way a word does when the mouth remembers the syllable. On a quiet Tuesday, a school group ran late, and the projectionist on early shift left apologetic notes like paper footprints. The tin of star plates had acquired a new page, this one in that careful red pencil again. If the ceiling breathes wrong, check the lower intake under row E. She didn't know ceilings could breathe wrong until she stood in row E and felt the air pull a little too eagerly near her ankles. The intake's grill wore a gray fur of dust. She brushed it off and heard the motor relax in its cage. It felt like being helped by someone with excellent bedside manners who would not step forward to claim credit. She didn't push, she answered. She wrote times in her own hand on new sheets. 12:3 algol wink to cover latch fix done. 12:51 hatch dogged city wash gone. She kept it tidy because she wanted the red pencil person to be pleased, even if that person was an old habit of the room and not a person at all. The first time the stars drew a line, it happened so tactfully she almost missed it. She brought Orion up to speak to a class video call Belts and Shoulders named Soared a Softer Spill, and faintly, without the green learning line she never used for audiences, the dome traced one line to the exit arrow in a single straight thought. Kids on screens wouldn't see it. She did. A minute later, the fire door made a tiny complaint in its hinge, just enough to ask for oil. She took the can with the long, thin spout and gave the hinge 2 drops. The next time she brought Orion, the line kept its attention to stars alone. She tried once to ignore a cue purely to test herself. The unwanted dot appeared near the bowl of the Big Dipper and held steady when the dipper moved. It stood, in that impossible way of dots and domes, over the control rack that powered the low seat lights. She thought, just for 10 seconds. Let's not. The rack's cooling fan lifted its tone half a step, a sound small but insistent, like a kettle before it admits a boil. It was not a scold. It was a nudge. She opened the rack, reseated a cable that had given itself permission to relax, and the fan relaxed too. The dot dissolved back into the ordinary sky. One evening, an old couple came in at the last minute, apologizing with their whole posture, coats damp with a sudden winter rain. Noor let them sit on the aisle. The man pressed fingers to his temple midway through the show, not in pain, just overwhelmed by the darkness, and the feeling of falling upward people sometimes get when a dome is too convincing. She lifted the Milky Way gently, let it dim, warmed the horizon a shade, as if the show itself were breathing with him. The ceiling kept faith. Halfway through the flight to Jupiter, the faintest spill of light leaked through a seam at the back, the sort of thing that never happens unless a door is open. It wasn't open. It was asking. She raised the star field just enough to hide the seam, then sent the faintest meteor through Cassiopeia exactly when the script called for a hush. Heads lifted. A heartbeat later, the spill closed. The seam went whole, and afterward the couple left with the careful gait of people who have seen something large and kept their balance. The newer digital system replaced some of the old glass and gears. The Zeiss stayed, bolted with a kind of reverence, like a grand piano in a room full of smaller pianos that could do more tricks. The digital sky could paint storms on Saturn. The iron star ball could make a darkness that felt like truth. On a calibration night, the two systems overlapped, and Noor saw the antique machine contribute a faint, unprogrammed sweep. Not a star, not a planet, a soft band like a hand curved to shelter a candle. It crossed to where the temporary planet kiosk had been left plugged into the wrong power strip, one that would complain at load. She moved it to the right. The sweep faded. Both systems returned to their lanes, old and new, agreeing about what mattered. They told a story for school kids about a navigator finding the north with nothing but stars and judgment. Noor liked to begin it with a moment of complete dark, and then the quiet rise of Polaris, placed so gently that eyes adjusted at their own pace. On a night when fog took the city in both hands, she stood under the blank dome ready to bring that single calm point. Before she touched the control, Polaris appeared of its own accord, exactly where it should be, no brighter than kindness. The projector's motor did not move. The digital rig did not hum. The star was simply there. Noor let the silence hold a little longer than the script asked for. People breathed out. A child whispered, "Found you," and the whole room agreed without words. There was a small brass plaque near the door most people missed, darkened with polite age. It named a director from years back who had kept the stars in order and the exits clear. Noor cleaned it with the soft cloth she used for lenses. She put nothing of what she suspected into any official note. She tightened screws, oiled hinges, kept an ear on fans, and learned to allow the sky to ask for a favor now and then. People later said that if you came to the late show on a night when weather had opinions, the exit signs seemed gentler, their green less scolding, as if calibrated by someone who cared as much about eyes as about safety. They said that sometimes a comet would cross at the exact moment a child calmed, or that a star would appear to point a person to a seat where the armrest didn't squeak. They said that in the darkest minute, if a person whispered steady into a sleeve, a single dot above the horizon would choose to answer. It never made a scene. That was the unsettling part. Quiet competence isn't dramatic. The dome kept its breath. The little red lights along the aisles held their stitch. And when the show ended and house lights rose to their softest gold, the old machine on its pedestal ticked once, the way a watch does when lifted, as if glad to be trusted with a sky for one more night. Story number 7. After hours, the pool had the sound of breathing. Tiles kept a polite shine. Ceiling trusses hid shadows in neat triangles. The water lay so still it reflected the lane flags as neat stitches across a blue seam. A wall clock presided with an even tick. The red sweep hand slid and never fussed. Humidity made the air taste faintly of pennies and citrus. The municipal baths were proud of their schedule. Lap swim, lessons, open swim, water aerobics, then a long held quiet until morning. Cass worked the late shift when the building learned how to sleep. Tests, backwash, skimmers, the slow roll of the automatic vacuum along the floor. She kept a log tucked in a zippered pouch. pH, free chlorine, gate valve set to half, deck checked, whirlpool shuttered. Her handwriting leaned practical. She liked the way light from underwater lamps pushed bright coins into the deep end and left the shallow end a friendly green. She whistled sometimes in the empty room and listened to the echo return as if deciding whether to applaud. Oddness began at the lane clock that hung at the far end, 4 faces, red hand for seconds, blue for minutes. On a Tuesday, at 1:19 exactly, without missing a beat, the red hand stopped. No skip, no struggle, just steady, frozen. She stood under it and felt air change near her cheek, a draft that should not be in an indoor pool. Then, as neatly as a restart after an official signal, the red hand swept forward to where it ought to have been and kept time. She wrote it down because keeping track is a way of being brave. A backboard leaned against the wall, straps rolled, buckle ends tucked. The letters rescue faced the water. After a night of ordinary readings, she found it flipped. Now the letters faced the deck. Nobody had come in. The door counters, those silent witnesses, recorded no trips. She turned the board back. The next night, it faced the deck again, fastened a little higher on its pegs as if placed with care by another pair of hands. She raised the bulkhead for the morning's long-course swim. The chain refused to catch, then settled itself with a firm click. When she walked past the lifeguard chair, the seat felt faintly warm, not in a way a person would notice unless they had sat in that chair 1,000 afternoons. She set her palm there and felt an echo of weight. The pool answered with a small, specific wave that ran from the shallowest tile to the gutters and back, the way a breath does when a person takes in news and decides what to do with it. Late in the month, storms pressed along the roof and patted at the high windows. A condensation bead traced a path down one pane. that others did not choose. It gathered its friends and drew a faint line that ended not in a drip but in a sharp dot exactly above a section of deck grating near lane 3. Cass knelt. The grate lifted easily, too easily, one anchor screw almost free. She tightened it, then tugged each neighbor. The line of water above held until she finished, then dissipated into the fog of the pane, as if it had done its job. The radio by the guard station picked up static at odd minutes like a secret trying to decide whether to become a word. At 2:03 one night, it issued a single clean tone, the same pitch as the electronic start they used for meets, then quieted. Cass looked up from the test kit. The underwater lights in lanes 2 and 3 glowed a shade deeper for a breath, and then returned. She walked the edge and saw nothing wrong except a body wave traveling the length of lane 3, as though a hand had skimmed the surface while passing. When it reached the end, it stopped. Perfectly on the tee. She did not ignore that. She checked the main drain gauges. The needle above the hair and lint strainer sat half a needle's width higher than yesterday. Not bad. Curious. She bled air from the pump, listened for the sound of a trapped bubble learning to move. The pump made a satisfied hush. The lane settled into plain water again. Stories traveled at the pool the way steam does on a cold day. People said there had been a head guard years back who could hear a slick foot 2 tiles away. They said she kept a spare whistle tucked under the seat in the chair and could flick it down with one finger without looking. They said she stayed late after they named the new HVAC system after a donor, just to make sure the air stayed good for small lungs. Cass heard the name Marta once, then not again. The safety chart on the office wall had a faded photo showing a whistle on a red lanyard, looped twice around a wrist. On a night when the team's coach asked for one last hour relays at the edge of curfew, the room wore the particular confidence of practiced breath. Kids laughed softer than usual, out of respect for how sound carries when it's time to go home. Cass cranked the bulkhead down to short course, checked the lane lines, tapped a knuckle on the starting blocks to be sure no wobble would find a heel. The red sweep hand on the lane clock paused at 1:19 again and held. The radio gave its single start note. A lane flag at 4 lanes in shivered and fell a few inches. Not enough to be a hazard, enough to be a notice. She walked to lane 4. On the deck below the flags, a small curl of vacuum hose had nudged itself out from behind the cart and learned how to make a loop where a bare foot would find it. She felt a prickling at the back of her neck and did not call it fear. She called it attention. She moved the hose. She followed the flag's line in her eye all the way to the deep end and glanced down at the grates. A single screw on the main drain cover had loosened a whisper. Nothing dramatic. Nothing to frighten. Enough. She closed the valve to slow the draw, dropped the reach pull down, and pressed the cover until the screw seated. The pump changed its mind about how it wanted to sound and chose a better song. When the relay began, something else joined the room's rhythm. The faint warmth on the lifeguard chair, not enough to feel with a hand, unless the hand wanted to, seemed to settle into vigilance. Midway through, a foot slapped off a turn too high and slid. The whistle sound that cut the air was not electronic. It was 2 short blasts, crisp, the kind that say, "Check your feet, everything's all right, keep going smooth." The swimmer steadied, laughed, carried on. The whistle did not echo. It didn't need to. After the kids left and steam from showers wrote momentary words on glass, Cass climbed the ladder to the high windows. A tiny chip in one pane she would never have seen from the deck had gathered a pearl of water again, a perfect sphere that clung until she touched it with the corner of a towel. Behind it, a hairline crack showed, the kind that grows if asked. She marked the pane with tape and wrote the work order with boring precision that would make a glazier nod. In the office, behind a binder labeled "Incidents Mostly Near Misses," she found a small tin. Inside lay a whistle, dull with age, and a note on the back of an old swim meet heat sheet. "If the red hand stops, listen. Don't hurry the dark." The handwriting made a modest arc through the M of Marta. She left the tin exactly where she found it. Word spread in the way regulars tell each other useful things. People said the pool could be spooky if you didn't like echoes. Others said it felt kinder than a church. They said on some nights the lane ropes tapped the water once and settled, like someone clapping softly at a drill done properly. They said a faint scent of wintergreen gum drifted when no one was chewing any. They said if you came in early, sometimes the backboard straps lay a little too smooth, as if a habit had gone through them with competent hands. Cass kept her log. She tightened what wanted tightening. She waited the extra breath at the lip before turning off the underwater lights, letting the dark meet the room gradually, the way a good guard keeps a crowd calm by being calm. If she passed the lifeguard chair on her way out, she touched the arm briefly without making a ceremony of it. The chair sometimes felt warm again, the kind of warmth that doesn't belong to temperature so much as to attention paid and returned. Story number 8. After midnight, the little station on the hill sounded like a sleeping animal. Fans breathing, relays murmuring, the tower's red beacons pulsing their steady heartbeat into the low clouds. Inside, foam on the walls swallowed echoes, and the on-air sign glowed as if it were in on the secret of who was listening. Evan worked those hours with a thermos, a stack of legal IDs, and the patience of a person who knows the difference between quiet and dead air. His log brimmed with neat times and initials: top of hour, weatherbed, transmitter check, EAS unit, armed each entry the small stitch that keeps a night from coming apart. Oddness began as a tone that didn't belong to any piece of equipment he knew. It wasn't the 3-note test or the comfortingly ugly buzz of an alert. At 1:37 it pealed a single, clear chime, like the sound a glass makes when a wet finger draws a circle, then stopped. The meters on the board did not flicker. The receiver's screen read what it always read. Somewhere in the lobby an ice machine knocked and resumed its patient work. He wrote the time anyway because writing down what a room does is how a person proves the room did it. The station's crest hung crooked in the hallway. A lightning bolt, a hill, the old call sign embossed under glass letters no one used anymore, except the handful who remembered a temporary change that didn't stick. When Evan straightened the frame, a brittle page fell from behind it, onion skin thin, typed by a machine that made O's look like eggs. Overnight road. Advisory, said the header. Read at intervals in foul weather. The script was spare and polite. Keep to posted speed on the east approach. If fog, use the reflector posts, not the center line. Thank you for keeping the night. He put the page on his desk, as if it had asked to be current. A woman called from somewhere outside town with a voice that sounded like a hand on a window pane, testing if the frost was thick enough for drawing. Thanks for the detour, heads up, she said. Would have taken the switchback and likely crawled, the way the wind set. He checked the log. He had read nothing of the sort. He had played a public service announcement for smoke alarms and a promo for a farmer's market. Say again? He asked. Because that's what you ask when the world offers you nonsense. She laughed softly, relieved. Just saying it helped, she said, and hung up. The tape rack held a scatter of retired carts, because stations keep old things the way garages keep useful bolts. At the back, behind a broken weather jingle, a blue cart sat labeled in the careful block letters of someone who likes labeling. Night Road Archive. He hadn't seen it before. He slid it into an empty slot on the board, thumbed the start. The recorder came alive with a hiss so soft it was almost affectionate, and then a voice his own read the advisory from the onion skin page with the level calm he used for news. He stopped it halfway, heart loud enough to hear in his ears. He hadn't recorded it. The cart stock had been out of circulation since before he'd been alive. He played it again at the top of the hour because the weather had turned the tower's guy wires into strings and the hill into an opinion. Between questions from the one insomniac who always wanted to talk about bird migrations and a trucker who never said where he was, the single chime came back at 2:09, then again at 2:41, then not at all. At 2:41, the tower beacon camera showed a blink that wasn't a blink, one light glowing a shade dimmer, then mending itself, the way a person fixes their tie as they pass a mirror. He wrote each time and underlined the page number on the advisory. The EAS receiver woke by itself and printed a half-fed strip before going back to sleep. The paper smelled faintly of ozone. The text wasn't an alert. It read like a log entry from another era with a polite signature at the end. Stay in voice for the east road when wind is from south. J.H. The initials meant nothing to him. The way the capital J leaned felt familiar in a way that belongs to houses and habits, not strangers. Wind came shouldering in near 3. The hill wore fog like a hood. The red beacons beat slower to his eye, even if their pace hadn't changed. The on-air sign's reflection shivered in the window glass above the board. When he took breath to read the advisory again, the studio monitors made the tiniest suggestion of the tone. It settled him, the way a cue light settles a stage. He read slowly, cleanly, without drama. Keep to the posts, not the paint. he said to an empty room and to the dark beyond the tower. In the lobby, the older phone rang, the one with the bell. A weight you can feel. He picked up. A man's voice made its way through rain. Just to say, the man began, and then stopped, embarrassed by the instinct to call a stranger. The posts. That was the thing, he said instead. They take the curve better than we think we do. The line cracked with weather and distance. Whoever told you to read that, you tell them thanks. Evan almost said he would, then said, "Will do." Which wasn't a lie if you considered the night something to tell. Once, when the playlist's automation hiccuped and tried for silence between tracks, the tape cart fired itself with a bright clack of the solenoid and filled the gap with its calm, paved words. Dead air avoided itself, the way a practiced hand catches a glass before it tips. He rolled the mic off and sat with his palms on the desk, feeling the board's low hum come up through the wood like a cat choosing a lap. Stories about the station live in lobbies and in the mouths of engineers. Someone named Jory, maybe the JH, had stayed during a flood and read road conditions all night. Someone else had died in their own bed after 3 consecutive blizzards and was buried under a sky so clear it sounded like a lie. No tragedies were recited like badges here. The building preferred competence to romance. Still, a brass tag on the back of the old teletype named a donor in small letters for keeping the signal steady on bad nights. On the last storm before spring rearranged the hill's idea of itself, the advisory cart rewound to its leader after one play, as if to say the point had been made. Evan tucked the onion skin inside a modern sleeve, wrote a clean copy, and left the original behind the crest where he'd found it. He did not try to explain any of it to the day staff. He told them the beacon camera needed watching. The East Road was a trickster when the wind came south, and the blue cart liked a gentle hand. Afterward, people said the little station felt different at night, not haunted, not even nostalgic. They said the songs landed where they were needed, that the weather voice seemed tuned for whoever had the highway for company, that a single bell tone sometimes preceded a calm announcement no one remembered hearing during the day. Truckers said the hill station spoke like a neighbor leaning on a fence. Nightwalkers said the tower's red lights blinked in a pattern they couldn't prove, one that read, "In the language of machines, standing by." The unsettling part wasn't anyone's sound. It was that the silence never fell hard. It was eased into and out of like a lane shift. A voice found the gap and filled it, not with fear, but with the exact words needed for a particular piece of road. And if a person, alone with a dial and a line of reflector posts through fog, whispered, "Thank you," to the windshield, something in the speaker's cloth seemed to warm and answer, as if the night itself had a pulse and was pleased to be noticed. Story number 9. The clock tower watched the town with 4 pale faces that never blinked. In daylight, its hands moved like the oars of a slow boat. At night, the dials glowed with a milky patience that made the square feel tended even when nobody crossed it. Stone shoulders held iron bones. Within, a cast-iron frame carried 3 trains of gears. A pendulum traced a steady arc that sounded like someone thinking, tick, tock, tick, tock. The bell above slept until asked, and then answered with a kind of measured kindness. Eloise kept it. Not as a grand title, just as a habit that fit her hands. Once a week, she climbed the narrow stairstone, then iron, then wood, each flight with its own particular note to wind the weights and oil what needed oil. She liked the ledger that lived on a shelf near the mechanism. Its columns were ruled in blue. Years marched across its pages in careful letters. Hour train wound. Quarters struck true. East face lamp temperamental. Gust from river good swing. She wrote small and neat, the way a person writes when they mean for the words to be used by someone else someday. Oddness began with a pause that was too polite to call a stop. On a still night in late autumn, as the hour approached midnight, the quarters rang their tidy music. 4 notes at the quarter, 8 at the half, 12 at the 3/4. The hour should have followed. The hammer lifted, the bell waited, and everything held a breath. Eloise felt it. The pendulum, firm as a metronome, carried on. Then, after the length of time it takes someone to look both ways at a crossing, the bell struck. 1, 2, up to 12, calm and complete. She wrote it down because noting tiny mercies is one way a building learns you are listening. The next time she came, A paper scrap waited under the pendulum's crutch, folded in two, edges browned. In pencil, a tidy hand had written, "If fog lies low from the river, give the hour a breath." The graphite had sunk into the paper's grain long ago. The fold had been pressed and pressed again. She lifted it and set it with the ledger, the way one moves a miniature and gives it a proper shelf. She tried to blame drafts. The tower liked to take the night's temperature through tiny seams in its shutters. Pigeons owned a ledge nobody could reasonably deny them. The mechanism, though built to ignore weather, felt everything as only precise things do. When fog came up from the river like something deliberate, the hours began to wait a fraction before announcing themselves, as if choosing not to startle the square into believing morning had arrived on a misstep. When the fog burned off, the strike fell true and prompt. Midweek, she found the stair's 13th step felt wrong. Not treacherous. Just the kind of wrong that tells a foot it will be surprised in a moment. She chalked a tiny mark on the riser, to remind herself. On her way down, she knelt with the little kit she kept near the weight chute screwdriver, wedges, a folded bit of leather, and tightened the tread. The wood sighed, a tiny shift from question to statement. She brushed her chalk away. The next ascent felt steady all the way. Eloise had learned the language of the room. The tinny knock of the warning bell on the quarter train when its hammer pin needed a touch. The deeper cough of the hour train if a pawl wanted oil. The soft rasp of a rope lifting its own dust as it rose with the weight. The oddness, as the weeks moved, wasn't frightening. It was a sense that someone else had learned this language once and continued to speak it when it was useful. A thunderstorm shouldered the town one night, straight and earnest. Lightning made a stray photograph of the weather vane at the tower's point and left the air tasting of pennies. The lights in the east face dimmed, then steadied. Eloise checked the small transformer that fed them. Its casing was warm, but no warmer than work allowed. Down below, a branch somewhere became someone else's problem. The clock ran on its own time, indifferent to electric fuss. The bell, which had learned the difference between weather and drama, held the half-minute again before the hour. In that gap, far below, a car moved through the square and did not hurry the turn. Behind the frame, on an iron crosspiece, where no one would leave anything on purpose, a stubby pencil had been wedged, and next to it a card with holes at one end, where a string had once lived. The card listed instructions for a hand crank Eloise had never used. In case of stoppage, lift, click, and keep even turns. Count 30 for a minute's worth. Someone had underlined even. In the margin, that same small hand had added, "Only if the town needs it." The crank hung where it always hung, clean from neglect. She turned it once, gently, feeling the fly governor approve, the escape wheel speak its dry syllables. Then she replaced the crank. It comforted her to know the path existed. She began to notice small courtesies the tower paid to other things. On market mornings, when the square filled with crates and umbrellas and voices, the hour fell with a shade more warmth, as if the bell could adjust its own edge. On snow nights, quarter chimes came softer, though the hammer lifted full. On the evening, a wedding party gathered at the edge of the square, and someone raised a glass at an hour they hadn't noticed coming. The bell gave the smallest stumble, a human kind of hesitation, and then struck gently enough that no one flinched. Once, she ignored the pause on purpose. No fog, no weather, a clear midnight. The bell should have spoken without ceremony. It waited. She faced the escapement and watched the pallet stones lift and fall as faithful as breath. She let the hammer hang. The weight line trembled with its own intention. No draft to blame. Somewhere below, a cyclist crossed the square, noticed the emptiness where sound should have been, and slowed at the corner, as if uncertain which street belonged to him at that hour. Eloise breathed out, lifted the fly with one finger so the train would run, and the bell, apologizing slightly without actually apologizing, stroked the air 12 times. She did not treat the clock like a mood after that. She treated it like a partner who sometimes knew something she didn't. The east face gave her the only true fright. One evening it went dark, not a flicker, a full refusal. The other faces glowed their steady milk. She climbed with the little box of spare bulbs and the soft cloth for glass. Behind the dial, in the drafty cavity where numbers became nothing but paint and glass and the idea of time, she found the contact spring bowed too far back. A sliver of metal thin as a fallen eyelash had wedged itself where it pressed. She teased it free with a fingernail. The light returned in a slow inhale. When she turned to go, the hair on her arms lifted, not with a chill, with attention. She looked once more and saw a number 4 had flaked its paint in a crescent. To anyone in the square, the face was whole. Up here, it was not. She dabbed the thinnest edge of protective varnish at its wound and wrote a note to the restorer who came twice a year. East face, IV, a whisper of help. In the ledger, the small hand's entries climbed backward through the years. A name appeared only once, in tiny initials. AR. The A might have been an H. The R looped with confidence. A penciled remark lived between 2 lines like a footnote. Never strike 13. If the fly chatter starts, let it finish thinking. Eloise smiled at the tone. A kind teacher with grease under their nails, and left a narrow white space in the margin under it, as if words needed breathing room too. On the winter solstice, the town held its lantern walk, a procession of coats and paper lights that moved like a new constellation through the streets and pooled in the square. Children held battery candles and sang with the kind of seriousness children give to things they've decided matter. The hour came up as gentle as a hand under a chin. Between 9 and 10, the bell offered a single, low note, no count, just one. People looked up, found their own faces reflected faintly in the glass of the dials, and smiled the way people smile when a large thing proves friendly. Others noticed later, as people do when rooms teach them. The clock seemed to know when to be a beat late or early, as if time itself had learned to look both ways before crossing. Bakers said the 6 o'clock strike had a crumbly edge on storm mornings, and they adjusted ovens without deciding they had done so because of a bell. Dog walkers said the quarter chime under fog felt like a hand at a shoulder saying, "Wait a breath, then go." Courthouse clerks said the noon stroke softened itself during exams at the school. A rumor said the tower would refuse to strike. At the instant a power line failed somewhere out along the river road, and that afterward, when crews had their bearings, the bell would speak with a small satisfaction. Eloise never saw anyone else on the stairs. She never felt watched. She felt accompanied by a craft older than her wrists, by instructions written in pencil, and the kind of patience that can sit inside machinery. On her last climb, before the spring maintenance closed the tower for a week, she left her own line in the ledger. The way people in long conversations sometimes add a sentence to keep a topic honest. Fog high, strike true. Fog low, give the hour a breath. That was the unsettling grace of it. Time that wasn't rigid or soft, but attentive. A measured kindness in iron and stone. The pendulum swung. The bell waited or spoke. And if a lone person on the square paused in the middle of the night and whispered, "Thank you," to the clock for making the dark feel accounted for, the faintest tremor would move through the hand on the dial, no more than a thought, as if to say, "Heard." And now, the voices grow quiet. The footsteps fade into the floorboards, and the shadows return to their corners. What lingers are only echoes, soft, patient, and waiting for another night. The stories rest, and so should you. Close your eyes, let the silence surround you, and drift into the dark with ease. Good night.